The bullet ricocheted off the weathered post just inches from Cecilia Carter's head as she ducked behind the water trough, clutching her travel bag with white knuckles. Even 500 miles from Denver, Harold's men had found her again. 4 years of running hadn't been enough to escape the shadow of a husband who'd vowed on his deathbed that she'd never know peace. Dust swirled around her skirts as she pressed herself against the rough wooden building of Willow Creek's only hotel. The frontier town, little more than a gathering of wooden structures along a single dirt street, had seemed remote enough when she'd stepped off the stagecoach yesterday. She'd been wrong. "Get down, madam." A deep voice called from across the street, followed by the sharp crack of a Winchester rifle. A man collapsed from the rooftop of the general store, his own weapon clattering to the boardwalk below. Cecilia's breath caught as she watched a tall figure emerge from the saloon, rifle still raised, scanning the rooflines for more gunmen. He crossed the street with long strides, spurs jingling with each step, the brim of his hat pulled low over his eyes. When he reached her, he crouched down, and Cecilia found herself staring into the most striking blue eyes she'd ever seen. "You hurt, madam?" he asked, his voice like gravel wrapped in velvet. "No, I don't think so," she managed, surprised at how steady her voice sounded despite the trembling in her limbs. "Name's Yates Jensen," he said, offering a calloused hand. "Town marshal, and you're in a heap of trouble, I reckon." Cecilia hesitated before taking his hand. "Cecilia Carter." "And yes, trouble seems to follow me these days." Marshal Jensen's eyes narrowed as he helped her to her feet. "That man up there wasn't local, hired gun by the look of him." He studied her face carefully. "Who's after you, Mrs. Carter?" The way he emphasized Mrs. made her wince. The gold band she still wore on her finger caught the afternoon sunlight. A prop, a disguise, a shield, but not a truth. "My husband," she said, then, correcting herself, "my late husband, or rather the men who worked for him." The marshal raised an eyebrow. "Your late husband has men still on his payroll," Harold made, "arrangements before he died. His brother carries them out." Cecilia brushed the dust from her skirts, a futile gesture in the ever-present grit of the frontier. "I should leave. I've brought danger to your town." "Town's seen worse," Marshal Jensen said, guiding her toward the sheriff's office with a gentle hand at her elbow. "Let's get you somewhere safe while I sort this out." Inside the small wooden building, Cecilia sank into a chair, her legs finally giving out. The marshal poured water from a pitcher into a tin cup and handed it to her. "Now, Mrs. Carter, I think you'd better start at the beginning." Cecilia took a sip, the water cool against her parched throat. "My husband was Harold Carter, a wealthy mine owner in Colorado. Our marriage was—" She paused, searching for a word less revealing than nightmare. "Difficult enough for you to run." There was no judgment in his tone, only a quiet understanding that surprised her. He was a violent man, controlling. "When I finally gathered the courage to leave, he suffered an apoplexy." The cup trembled slightly in her hand. "Before he died, he promised I'd never be free of him. He made his brother Nathaniel executor of his will with one condition: I would receive nothing unless I returned to live in his house under Nathaniel's supervision. And if you didn't, then Nathaniel would inherit everything, with funds set aside specifically to ensure I was found and brought back." The marshal's jaw tightened. "Sounds like your husband's shadow has a long reach." 4 years, she whispered. 4 years of running. Every time I think I've finally escaped, every time I begin to build something resembling a life. They find you," he finished. She nodded, fighting back tears. "I've been a schoolteacher, a seamstress, a cook, anything to survive, but I can never stay." Marshal Jensen leaned against his desk, arms crossed. "Why not just go back and contest the will? Surely the court's Nathaniel is a judge," she interrupted. "Harold's friends own the newspapers, the banks, half the territory's politicians. There's no justice for me there." A long silence stretched between them as the marshal considered her words. Finally, he straightened and moved toward the door. "Stay here. Lock this behind me." "I need to make arrangements." "For what?" He paused, his hand on the doorframe. "To get you somewhere safe." Before she could respond, he was gone. Cecilia crossed the room and turned the key in the lock, then returned to her chair, staring at the dust motes dancing in the shafts of sunlight through the window. For the 100th time, she wondered if running had been a mistake. Perhaps it would have been easier to simply die in that house, beneath Harold's iron fist, but then she thought of the garden she'd planted in Tennessee before they'd found her. The student she'd taught in Missouri before a man with cold eyes had appeared at her boarding house. The brief taste of freedom, of choosing her own path, had become an addiction she couldn't surrender. An hour passed before a knock came at the door. "Mrs. Carter, it's Jensen." She opened the door to find the marshal accompanied by an older woman with silver-streaked hair and kind eyes. "This is Mrs. Abernathy," he explained. "She runs the boarding house at the edge of town. You'll stay with her tonight." "I can't put others in danger," Cecilia protested. Mrs. Abernathy made a dismissive sound. "Nonsense, child. Yates here tells me you're in trouble, and that's all I need to know. My late husband was a Texas Ranger, and I've still got his shotgun and the skill to use it." The marshal's lips quirked in what might have been the beginning of a smile. "Nobody will think to look for you there. Tomorrow at dawn, we leave for my ranch outside town." Cecilia asked, startled. "My deputy can handle things here for a spell. I've got a place up in the foothills, remote, defensible." His eyes met hers. "He'll find no trail there." The conviction in his voice almost made her believe him. Almost. That night, in the small but clean room at Mrs. Abernathy's boarding house, Cecilia pulled a worn leather journal from her bag. Inside were pressed wildflowers from each place she'd stayed, temporary bookmarks in the story of her flight. She had nothing from Willow Creek yet. She wondered if she'd be here long enough to find something worth preserving. Sleep came fitfully, punctuated by dreams of running through endless corridors in Harold's Denver mansion, his voice echoing behind her. "Till death do us part, my dear, and even then." Dawn found her already dressed, her few possessions packed. A soft knock at her door revealed Mrs. Abernathy with a tray of breakfast and coffee. "Marshall's waiting out back," the older woman said. "Says it's best if folks don't see you leaving with him." Cecilia nodded gratefully. "You've been very kind. Kindness costs nothing," Mrs. Abernathy replied with a wink. "Now eat up. Yates Jensen may be the most competent man I know, but he rides hard and expects others to keep pace." True to her word, the marshal was waiting behind the boarding house with 2 horses, his own tall bay gelding and a smaller, dappled mare. "You ride?" he asked, offering a hand to help her mount. "My father raised horses in Virginia," she replied, settling into the saddle with practiced ease. Before the war, something like approval flickered in his eyes. "Good. We've got ground to cover." They rode in silence as the sun climbed higher, following game trails through pine forests and across open meadows where wildflowers nodded in the morning breeze. Cecilia found herself studying the marshal's profile when he rode ahead, the strong jaw, the quiet confidence in his posture, the way he constantly scanned their surroundings. "How long have you been marshal?" she asked when they stopped to rest the horses beside a clear stream. 3 years in Willow Creek, wore a badge in Wyoming Territory before that. He handed her a canteen. "Fought with the Union Army before turning to law work. And now you're risking your position to help a stranger." He shrugged, adjusting his hat against the sun. "Badge means protecting folks who need it. Don't recall any fine print saying I had to stay in town to do it. Still, I'm grateful. Save your thanks until we've sorted this mess." He remounted his horse. "We've got another hour's ride." The terrain grew steeper as they climbed into the foothills. Pine gave way to aspen groves, their leaves shimmering like gold coins in the breeze. Finally, they crested a ridge, and Cecilia caught her breath at the view. A small valley spread before them, nestled between protective slopes. A log cabin with a stone chimney stood near a creek that wound through lush pastureland. Several horses grazed in a fenced paddock, and a barn weathered to silver gray stood nearby. "Your ranch," she said, taking in the peaceful scene. "Started building it before I took the marshal's job. Someday I'll hang up the badge and raise horses full-time." He led the way down the slope. "Not many folks know about this place. Those who do have no reason to connect it to you." The cabin was simple but well built, with 2 rooms separated by a stone fireplace that served both spaces. The main room held a table, chairs, and a small sofa covered with a Navajo blanket. A bookshelf filled with volumes stood against one wall, surprising her. "You read," she observed. "Long winters," he replied, somewhat defensively. "Kitchen's through there." "My room's on the other side of the fireplace. You'll take the bed, I'll use the sofa." "I couldn't possibly. You can and will," he interrupted. "My mother would haunt me if I put a lady on the sofa." He moved about the cabin with efficient motions, starting a fire, bringing in water from the well outside. Cecilia found herself standing awkwardly in the center of the room, uncertain of her place in this man's domain. "I should earn my keep," she said finally. "I can cook, clean, there's flour and such in the pantry," he conceded. "I won't turn down a home-cooked meal, been eating my own cooking too long." That evening, as they sat at the rough-hewn table, eating the stew and biscuits she'd prepared, Cecilia felt a strange sense of domesticity she hadn't experienced since before her marriage. The Marshal Yates, as he'd insisted she call him outside of town, ate with appreciation, the silence between them comfortable rather than strained. "How long can we stay here?" she asked finally, the question that had been weighing on her mind he considered before answering. "Week, maybe 2. I told folks in town I was tracking rustlers. That'll hold for a spell." He studied her across the table. "Gives us time to figure out your next move." "There is no next move," she said softly. "Just another town, another false name, waiting for them to find me again." "There's always another move," he countered. "Just might not be the one you've been playing." That night, lying in his bed surrounded by the unfamiliar scent of pine and leather that seemed to be part of him, Cecilia allowed herself to imagine, just for a moment, what it might be like to stop running. To build something permanent, to trust someone again, it was a dangerous thought. More dangerous than the men who hunted her, days passed in a rhythm that felt increasingly natural. Mornings found them tending to the horses and the small vegetable garden behind the cabin. Afternoons, Yates would ride the boundaries of his property, checking for any sign of intruders, while Cecilia read from his collection of books or worked on mending clothes that had clearly been neglected. They spoke of small things at first: the weather, the horses, the quality of the coffee. Gradually, their conversations deepened. He told her about growing up in Pennsylvania, his time in the war, the nightmares that still woke him sometimes. She shared stories of her childhood in Virginia, her dreams of becoming a teacher before Harold had entered her life. She did not speak of her marriage, and he did not ask. But the unspoken hung between them, growing heavier with each passing day. On the 7th evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and crimson, Yates finally broke the silence. "How did you meet him?" "Carter, I mean." Cecilia's hands stilled on the shirt she was mending. "My father died after the war, left us with debts. Harold was a business associate who offered to help." She set the mending aside. "He was charming at first, generous. By the time I saw the truth, the wedding had already taken place. And then I learned that what Harold wanted wasn't a wife but a possession, something to display when convenient and lock away when not." Her voice remained steady, though her fingers trembled slightly. "He had rules. So many rules: how I dressed, how I spoke, when I could leave the house, which was rarely. Breaking them resulted in consequences." Yates' jaw tightened, but he remained silent, waiting. The servants knew, of course, his friends suspected, but he was powerful, respected, no one would help. She took a deep breath. "When he suffered his apoplexy, the doctor was called. While they tended to him downstairs, I packed a bag. I heard him shouting as I slipped out the servants' entrance, promising I'd never be free of him. He died that night, 3 days later. I was already on a train east by then." She met his eyes. "I didn't kill him, if that's what you're wondering, though I won't pretend I mourned." "Never crossed my mind that you did," he said quietly. "Man like that dying was probably the kindest thing he ever did for you." A startled laugh escaped her. "That's a terrible thing to say. Truth often is." He stood, stretching. "Getting late. I'll check the horses before turning in." She watched him cross the yard to the barn, his figure outlined against the deepening twilight. For the first time in years, she'd spoken the truth of her marriage aloud, and he hadn't looked at her with pity or disgust. just that steady acceptance that seemed to be his natural state. Later, as she lay in bed listening to him move about in the main room, Cecilia realized something that should have terrified her but somehow didn't. She was beginning to trust Yates Jensen. And trust was a luxury she hadn't been able to afford for a very long time. The next morning, Cecilia woke to find Yates already gone, a note on the table informing her he'd ridden to check the north pasture and would return by midday. She went about her morning tasks, feeding the chickens that provided their eggs and weeding the small garden. The sun had reached its zenith when she heard hoofbeats approaching. Relief flooded through her, followed immediately by alarm. There were multiple riders. She rushed inside, grabbing the shotgun Yates had shown her how to use. Through the window, she watched as 4 men rode into the yard. None of them was Yates. Her blood turned to ice as she recognized one of the riders, George Willard, one of Harold's former security men. They'd found her. Again, Cecilia weighed her options. The shotgun was loaded with 2 shells, and she knew there were more in the drawer beside the fireplace. But 4 armed men? The odds weren't in her favor. The cabin's back window opened onto the forest, if she could reach the trees. A sharp knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. "Mrs. Carter, we know you're in there. Mr. Nathaniel Carter just wants to talk." Her hands trembled on the shotgun. They were lying, of course. Nathaniel didn't want to talk. He wanted to drag her back to Denver in chains if necessary, to control Harold's fortune through her. Another knock, harder this time. "Don't make this difficult, madam. We're authorized to use whatever means necessary." The back window it was, then. Cecilia moved silently through the cabin, the shotgun clutched to her chest. She had just reached the bedroom when the front door splintered open. She fired without hesitation, the blast catching the first man through the door in the shoulder. He went down with a cry of pain. The second shot she aimed at the ceiling, hoping to buy time as she bolted through the bedroom and out the window. Gunfire erupted behind her as she sprinted for the tree line, skirts hitched up around her knees. A bullet splintered bark near her head as she reached the first pines. She didn't look back, pushing deeper into the forest, trying to remember the trails Yates had shown her. The north pasture, he'd said he was checking the north pasture, if she could find him. Branches whipped at her face as she ran, the sound of pursuit growing more distant as she wove through the dense undergrowth. Her lungs burned, but fear drove her forward. She'd been in this position before, running for her life from Harold's men, but never in such rugged terrain. After what seemed like hours but was likely only minutes, Cecilia slowed, listening. The forest had gone quiet, too quiet. She changed direction, moving carefully now, trying to make as little noise as possible. A hand clamped over her mouth from behind, and she fought wildly until a familiar voice whispered in her ear. "Easy, it's me." Relief made her knees buckle as Yates released her. He looked grimmer than she'd ever seen him, a rifle in one hand, his other arm bloodied. "You're hurt," she gasped. "Grazed me when I was riding back, heard the shots." His eyes scanned the forest. "How many?" "4. I wounded one with the shotgun." He nodded, a flash of approval in his eyes. "Good, they'll be searching the woods. We need to move." "Where?" "I've got a place. Old Trapper's cabin, this way." He led her through the forest with the confidence of someone who knew every tree and rock. They crossed a shallow stream, walking in the water for several hundred yards before climbing a steep, rocky slope that left Cecilia breathless. The trapper's cabin was little more than a one-room shack built against the side of a cliff, nearly invisible until they were upon it. Inside, it was dusty but dry, with a small fireplace and a narrow cot. "Hunters use it sometimes," Yates explained, checking the perimeter before allowing her inside. "Few folks know about it. Your arm needs tending," she insisted once they were inside. He submitted to her ministrations with reluctance, removing his shirt to reveal a bloody furrow across his upper arm. As she cleaned the wound with water from his canteen and strips torn from her petticoat, Cecilia found herself acutely aware of his proximity, of the play of muscles beneath her fingers. "How did they find me?" she asked to distract herself from these unsettling thoughts. "Been thinking on that," he replied, wincing slightly as she tied the makeshift bandage. Nobody in town knew where we were heading except Mrs. Abernathy, and she wouldn't talk. Then how, he met her eyes. Someone's been tracking me, not you. They must have figured I'd lead them to you eventually. The implication hit her like a physical blow. This is my fault. You're wounded, your home is invaded, all because of me. My choice, he said firmly, made it the moment I saw you in town with trouble on your heels. Why? The question burst from her before she could stop it. Why risk everything for a stranger? Yates looked away, his profile sharp against the dimness of the cabin. Maybe I'm tired of watching people with power crush those without it. Maybe I've seen too many women with fear in their eyes, just like you had. He paused. Or maybe there was something about you that made walking away impossible. The silence that followed was charged with something Cecilia wasn't ready to name. She busied herself with arranging their meager supplies, the canteen, a small bag of jerky Yates had been carrying, the revolver he'd handed her. What now? She asked finally. We wait till dark, then circle back to the ranch. If they're still there, we'll have the advantage of surprise. And if we manage to drive them off, then we ride. Tonight, his expression was resolute. I've got friends in Arizona territory. We can disappear there until we figure out a more permanent solution. We, she repeated softly. You keep saying we. Your life is here, your position, your ranch buildings can be rebuilt, badges can be replaced. His hand found hers in the gathering darkness. Some things matter more. The touch of his calloused fingers against hers sent warmth spreading through her chest. For the first time since she'd fled Denver, Cecilia allowed herself to believe that perhaps her future could be more than an endless flight from the past. As night fell, they made their way back toward the ranch, moving silently through the forest. The moon was a silver crescent, providing just enough light to navigate by. Yates led the way, stopping often to listen and check for signs of pursuit. They reached the edge of the clearing where the cabin stood, crouching in the shadows to observe. A lantern burned in the window and 2 horses remained tied at the hitching post. 2 still here, Yates whispered. Others might be searching the woods or they've gone for reinforcements. What's the plan? He checked his rifle. I circle around to the barn, create a distraction. You stay hidden until I signal, then make for the horses. And leave you to face them alone. No, Cecilia clutched his arm. We go together or not at all. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Stubborn woman, he considered for a moment. All right, follow me to the barn, stay low. They crept through the shadows, using the paddock fence as cover until they reached the barn. Inside, Yates quickly saddled 2 horses while Cecilia kept watch through a crack in the wooden wall. One's coming out, she whispered as the cabin door opened. Yates handed her the reins to the dappled mare she'd ridden before. When I fire, ride hard for the trail we used today. Don't wait for me. Yates, promise me, Cecilia. The urgency in his voice silenced her protest. She nodded reluctantly. He positioned himself at the barn door, rifle raised. Ready. Before she could answer, a voice called from outside. Jensen, we know you're here. Come out and bring the woman. Nobody needs to die tonight. Yates' jaw tightened. He glanced at Cecilia, then shouted back, You're trespassing on my property, damaged my home, assaulted an officer of the law, plenty of reasons for someone to die tonight. A short laugh answered him. An officer of the law harboring a fugitive, that badge won't protect you. Mr. Carter is offering a reward for his sister-in-law's return dead or alive. Think about that before you make any foolish decisions. Cecilia's blood ran cold. Dead or alive, the pretense of merely bringing her home had been abandoned. Last chance, Jensen. Yates looked at her, a decision crystallizing in his eyes. Change of plans, he murmured. When I open this door, ride straight at them. Don't stop, don't slow down. The surprise might be enough. And you, right behind you, he gripped her hand briefly. Trust me. Before she could respond, he flung the barn door wide and fired 2 rapid shots toward the cabin. Cecilia urged her mare forward, bending low over the horse's neck as they burst into the open. A man shouted in surprise, a gun discharging wildly as her horse thundered past. She heard Yates' horse behind her, the rhythm of hoofbeats punctuated by more gunfire. Something hot grazed her arm, but she didn't slow, keeping her focus on the trail ahead as they plunged into the darkness of the forest. They rode hard for nearly an hour, following game trails by moonlight, crossing streams to obscure their trail. Finally, when the horses began to tire, Yates signaled for them to stop in a small clearing. "Let me see your arm," he said immediately, dismounting and coming to her side. "It's nothing, just a scratch," she protested, though the sleeve of her dress was torn and bloodied. He insisted on examining it anyway, his touch gentle as he pushed the fabric aside to reveal a shallow furrow similar to his own wound. "Bullet grazed you, could have been much worse." "Did we lose them?" Yates nodded, listening to the night sounds around them. "For now, but they'll pick up our trail come morning. We need to keep moving." He glanced at the sky. "Northeast, there's a mining town called Copper Springs about 40 miles from here. We can get supplies, fresh horses." Then Arizona, he confirmed, helping her back onto her horse. They rode through the night, stopping only briefly to rest the horses and drink from streams they crossed. As dawn broke, painting the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold, Cecilia found herself studying Yates' profile in the growing light. The past week had changed something fundamental between them. She had begun to see not just the competent lawman but the man beneath, thoughtful, principled, with a quiet strength that asked for nothing in return. And if the way his eyes followed her when he thought she wasn't looking was any indication, perhaps he saw something in her as well. "What will you do in Arizona?" she asked as they paused to let the horses drink. "Got an old army friend who runs a horse ranch near Prescott. Always said there was a place for me if I wanted it." He squinted at the horizon. "Might be time to take him up on that offer." "Because of me," she said softly. "You're giving up everything because of me." Yates turned to face her fully, his expression serious. "I'm not giving up anything I can't live without. The badge, the cabin, they're just things. What matters is doing what's right." He hesitated, then added, "And maybe finding something I didn't know I was looking for until you stepped off that stage coach." The words hung between them, weighted with meaning. Cecilia felt a flush rise to her cheeks, a sensation she hadn't experienced since before her marriage, the fluttering awareness of something new and fragile taking root. Before she could respond, Yates stiffened, his attention caught by something in the distance. "Riders," he said tersely. "Coming fast." Cecilia turned to see a cloud of dust on the trail behind them. "How did they find us so quickly?" Questions later. "Ride now." They pushed their already tired horses to a gallop, heading for a ridge of rocky outcroppings that might provide cover. The horses were laboring, foam flecking their necks as they reached the shelter of the rocks. "Dismount," Yates ordered, sliding from his saddle and drawing his rifle. "Horses need rest or they'll founder." Cecilia followed suit, taking the revolver he handed her. They positioned themselves behind a large boulder, watching as the dust cloud drew nearer. "3 riders," Yates observed, his voice tight. "They'll be on us in minutes." "We can't outrun them," Cecilia said, the reality of their situation settling like lead in her stomach. "Not on these horses." Yates was silent for a long moment, his eyes never leaving the approaching riders. When he finally spoke, his voice had a new resolve. "There's another way, one that ends this for good." "What do you mean?" "Your husband is dead, but his shadow still darkens your life because of the fortune he left." He turned to her, his blue eyes intense. "What if that fortune was no longer tied to you?" Understanding dawned. "If I were legally dead, Nathaniel would inherit everything. No more reason to hunt you." The idea was both terrifying and liberating. "But how? Those men have seen us both, they know we're alive." "Not if they don't recognize the bodies." Yates gestured to the rocky slope above them. "There's a ledge up there. If we cause a rock slide, crush the horses. Leave your dress on one of the bodies." Cecilia inhaled sharply. "You're suggesting we fake our deaths?" "It would give us a fresh start. New names, new lives." His hand found hers. "Freedom." The riders were close enough now that they could hear the pounding of hooves. Time was running out. "Do you trust me?" Yates asked, his eyes never leaving hers. In that moment, with death approaching and the future uncertain, Cecilia realized that she did trust him completely. More than that, she was beginning to believe in the possibility of a future where she wasn't constantly looking over her shoulder, a future that might include the man before her. "Yes," she said simply. "I trust you." His smile was brief but genuine. "Then let's die together, Mrs. Carter." What followed was a blur of activity. They led their exhausted horses up a narrow trail to the ledge Yates had spotted. Below, their pursuers had dismounted, following their tracks cautiously. Yates positioned several large rocks at the edge of an unstable section, then took Cecilia's dress, now torn and bloodied from her wound. "Ready?" he asked, draping the dress over a fallen log they'd positioned to look like a body from a distance. Cecilia nodded, dressed now only in her chemise, petticoat, and boots. She felt strangely liberated, as if shedding the dress was the first step in shedding her old identity. Together, they pushed against the rocks until they began to shift. The first few stones tumbled down, then more, until a cascade of earth and rock thundered down the slope. The horses, startled by the noise, backed away from the edge, all except one, which lost its footing and fell with the landslide. Shouts of alarm rose from below as their pursuers scrambled for cover. When the dust settled, Yates peered carefully over the remaining edge. "They're checking the debris," he reported. "One horse down, your dress visible." He pulled back. "Now we move, quietly." They led the remaining horse along the ridgeline, staying low to avoid being silhouetted against the sky. Behind them, they could hear men's voices, too distant to make out words but with the unmistakable tone of those who have found what they sought. For hours, they moved through the rugged terrain, taking turns riding the single horse, always keeping to higher ground where they could watch for pursuit. By midday, there was no sign of followers. "They believed it," Cecilia said, relief washing through her as they paused in the shade of a pine grove. "They think we're dead, seem to have," Yates agreed cautiously. "Still, we keep moving. Copper Springs by nightfall, then we vanish for good." As the sun began its descent, they caught sight of smoke from chimneys in the distance Copper Springs, nestled in a valley between two ridges. The mining town was larger than Willow Creek, with several streets of buildings and the headframes of mines visible against the hillsides. "We'll need supplies," Yates said as they approached the outskirts. "New clothes for you, food, horses, and we'll need to be careful. Word travels fast, even between remote towns." "What names should we use?" Cecilia asked. The prospect of a new identity was both exciting and daunting. Yates considered. "I've got papers for a land claim in Arizona under the name Thomas Wilson, old trail name I used once. You could be—" "Sarah," she supplied. "Sarah Wilson, your wife." He looked at her sharply, surprise evident in his expression. "My wife." "A woman traveling alone draws attention," she explained, though the flutter in her stomach had little to do with practicality. "A married couple is safer." Something shifted in his eyes, a warmth that made her breath catch. "Mrs. Wilson it is, then." They entered Copper Springs as dusk fell, their appearance drawing curious glances. Cecilia in her underthings with Yates' coat draped around her shoulders, both of them dusty and trail-worn on a single exhausted horse. The general store was still open, its proprietor raising eyebrows at their appearance. "Had some trouble on the trail," Yates explained, keeping his voice different from his usual tone, higher with a hint of an accent. "Bandits took most of our things. Need to outfit my wife and myself for travel." The storekeeper's suspicion faded at the sight of the gold coins Yates placed on the counterpart of the emergency funds he carried in a hidden pocket. While Cecilia selected the simplest dress available along with practical items for travel, Yates purchased food supplies and inquired about horses. "Liveries down the street," the storekeeper informed him. "Might have some stock for sale, but they won't be cheap." Lot of miners needing transportation these days. By the time they left the store, night had fallen completely. They made their way to the livery stable, where Yates negotiated the purchase of 2 sturdy horses and saddles, paying more than their worth to discourage questions. "One more stop," he said as they led the horses through the quiet streets. "Telegraph office. Need to send a message to my friend in Arizona." The telegraph operator was preparing to close for the night, but agreed to send one last message. Yates wrote out a brief note introducing Thomas Wilson and wife and inquiring about work opportunities. He paid the fee, then added a generous tip. "Any messages come for Wilson, hold them at Prescott office," he instructed. "We'll check when we arrive." With their immediate needs addressed, they sought lodging at a small boarding house at the edge of town. The elderly woman who ran it looked at them with mild concern but asked no questions when Yates explained they'd been robbed on the trail. "Been married long?" she asked as she showed them to a small but clean room. "Not long enough," Yates replied with a smile that transformed his usually serious face. He took Cecilia's hand in his, and she was surprised by how natural it felt. Every day's still a blessing. When they were alone, the pretense fell away, replaced by an awkward awareness of the single bed that dominated the small space. "I'll sleep on the floor," Yates said immediately, setting their bags down. "Don't be ridiculous," Cecilia responded, though her heart was beating faster. "You're wounded, we're both exhausted, the bed is big enough." He looked at her uncertainly. "Cecilia." "Sarah," she corrected with a small smile, "and you're Thomas now, we should practice our new names." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Sarah, then, are you certain?" She nodded, though certainty was far from what she felt. What she did feel was a growing awareness of Yates Thomas not as her protector, but as a man. A good man, one who had risked everything for her without expectation of return. They prepared for bed with careful courtesy, taking turns using the small wash basin to clean off the trail dust. Cecilia changed into the new nightgown she'd purchased, while Yates removed his boots and outer shirt but remained otherwise dressed. When they finally lay side by side in the narrow bed, a careful distance between them, Cecilia found herself acutely aware of his presence, the rhythm of his breathing, the warmth radiating from his body. "Do you really think it worked?" she asked softly. "That they believe we're dead?" "We'll know soon enough, if they stop searching, if no new men come looking." He turned his head to look at her in the dim light from the single window. "Either way, we keep moving. By the time we reach Arizona, Cecilia Carter and Yates Jensen will be nothing but ghosts. And Sarah and Thomas Wilson will begin their life together," she murmured. His hand found hers in the darkness, fingers intertwining. "Get some sleep. Long ride tomorrow." But sleep proved elusive as Cecilia's mind raced with the day's events and the uncertain future ahead. Beside her, Yates' breathing eventually deepened into the rhythm of sleep, his hand still clasping hers loosely. She studied his face in repose, the stern lines softened by sleep, and felt a surge of something she'd thought long buried hope. Not just for safety or freedom from fear, but for the possibility of happiness. Of love. The thought should have terrified her. After Harold, she'd sworn never to trust a man again, never to give anyone that power over her life. Yet here she was, placing her future in Yates Jensen's hands. And rather than fear, she felt only a quiet certainty that he would never use that trust against her. Morning came too soon, sunlight streaming through the small window to find them still hand in hand. Cecilia woke first, momentarily disoriented before memory returned. Yates Thomas slept on, his face relaxed in a way she'd never seen when he was awake. She allowed herself a moment to simply look at him, to acknowledge the feelings growing within her. Then, gently disentangling their hands, she rose to prepare for the day's journey. They left Copper Springs as the town was coming to life, riding south toward the Arizona territory. The new horses were fresh and eager, making good time along the rugged trail. They spoke little, both watchful for any sign of pursuit, but the comfortable silence between them was a marked change from the tension of the previous days. "How far to Prescott?" Cecilia asked as they stopped to rest the horses near midday. 4, maybe 5 days at this pace," Yates replied, scanning the horizon. "Longer if we're careful about being seen. And your friend, will he help us? Jake Hollister and I served together, saved each other's lives more times than I can count." He offered her the canteen. "He's a good man." "Trustworthy?" "Like you," she said simply. A faint color touched his cheekbones, visible even beneath his tan. "Hardly a saint, Sarah." The use of her new name startled her briefly, then brought a smile. "Not a saint, Thomas, just a good man. They're rarer than you might think." His eyes held hers for a long moment, something unspoken passing between them. Then he cleared his throat and turned back to the horses. We should keep moving. The days that followed settled into a pattern. They rode from dawn until dusk, avoiding settlements when possible, camping under the stars. When they did encounter other travelers, they presented themselves as Thomas and Sarah Wilson, heading to Arizona to start a horse ranch. The roles they played began to feel less like pretense and more like glimpses of a possible future. Thomas was more open than Yates had been, quicker to smile, his hand often finding Sarah's as they sat by the campfire. And Sarah was nothing like the frightened woman Cecilia had been. She was confident, speaking her mind freely, unafraid to meet the eyes of strangers. On the fourth night, as they camped in a sheltered canyon, a sudden spring storm blew in, driving them to seek refuge beneath an overhanging ledge. Rain pounded the landscape, transforming the dusty ground to mud within minutes. Huddled together for warmth, Cecilia found herself pressed against Yates' chest, his arms around her to conserve heat. "Sorry," he murmured, his breath warm against her hair. "Should have seen the storm coming. Made camp earlier." "It's not your fault," she replied, shivering slightly as water dripped from the ledge above. "Nature follows its own rules." "Like people," he said thoughtfully. "Some storms you can see coming, others hit without warning." She tilted her head to look at him. "Which was I?" His eyes, so blue in the fading light, studied her face. The kind that changes the landscape forever. The simple honesty of his words stole her breath. Before she could respond, he continued, "I've been thinking about what happens when we reach Prescott. Your friend's ranch." "Yes, but more than that." His arms tightened slightly around her. "This pretense of being husband and wife, it doesn't have to be pretense, Sarah," her heart stuttered. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I care for you, more than I should, perhaps, given how short a time we've known each other." He looked away briefly, then back, his gaze direct. "I'm saying I'd like to make it real if you'd consider it." The rain seemed to fade into the background as Cecilia processed his words. After Harold, she'd believed herself incapable of trusting again, of opening her heart to the possibility of love. Yet here it was, offered without demands or conditions. "I don't know if I remember how," she admitted softly. "To be a wife, I mean, my experience wasn't." "We'd write our own rules," he interrupted gently. "Equal partners, no chains, no ownership." His hand came up to brush a strand of damp hair from her face. "Just two people choosing each other day after day." The tenderness in the gesture undid her. Cecilia felt tears well in her eyes, not of sadness or fear, but of a hope so intense it was almost painful. "I'd like that," she whispered. "To choose you, to be chosen." Something in his expression shifted, a tension releasing. Slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, he lowered his head until his lips met hers. The kiss was gentle at first, a question more than a demand. When she responded, her hands coming up to frame his face, it deepened into something more profound, a promise, a beginning. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, the rain had slowed to a gentle patter. Yates rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed. "We should try to sleep," he said, though he made no move to release her. "Long ride tomorrow." Cecilia nodded, settling more comfortably against him. For the first time in years, she fell asleep without fear dogging her dreams, secure in the knowledge that whatever came next, she would not face it alone. The final day of their journey dawned clear and bright, the storm having washed the landscape clean. As they crested a hill, the settlement of Prescott came into view in the valley below, larger than Willow Creek but still small by Eastern standards, with wooden buildings clustered around a central plaza. "Home," Yates said, a question in his voice as he looked at Cecilia. She smiled, the expression reaching her eyes in a way it rarely had before. "Home," she agreed. They rode into town slowly, both alert for any sign of recognition or threat, but the residents of Prescott paid them little mind beyond the curious glances newcomers always received in frontier towns. The telegraph office was their first stop. As Yates had hoped, a message awaited Thomas Wilson, brief but welcoming, with directions to the Hollister Ranch 5 miles outside of town. "Seems your friend is expecting us," Cecilia observed as they remounted their horses. Yates nodded, relief evident in the set of his shoulders. Jake's reliable that way, always has been. The Hollister Ranch was impressive by frontier standards, a sprawling main house of hewn logs, several outbuildings, and extensive corrals filled with fine horses. As they approached, a tall man with graying hair emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on a cloth. His eyes widened as he recognized Yates, then narrowed as he glanced quickly around to ensure they were unobserved. "Didn't expect you quite so soon," he said, his voice carefully neutral as he approached. "Thomas, isn't it?" "That's right," Yates replied, dismounting and extending his hand. "And this is my wife, Sarah." Jake Hollister's weathered face broke into a genuine smile as he took Cecilia's hand to help her from her horse. "Madam, any wife of Thomas is welcome here." Once inside the house, with doors closed and curtains drawn, the pretense dropped away. "Damn, Yates, when I got your message." Jake shook his head. "Thought you were dead. Word came through that a marshal and some woman were killed in a landslide being pursued by bounty hunters." "That was the idea," Yates explained, accepting the whiskey Jake poured. "Needed to disappear, and you bring your troubles to my doorstep." There was no heat in the question, only wry acceptance. "Wouldn't have come if I thought danger would follow," Yates said seriously. "We were thorough, left evidence, bodies identified, though not much was left to identify." Jake's eyes shifted to Cecilia. "And you must be the reason for all this drama. Care to explain why my old friend has abandoned his badge and faked his death?" Briefly, Cecilia outlined her situation: Harold's abuse, his death, the relentless pursuit by his brother's men. As she spoke, Jake's expression grew increasingly grim. "Bastards," he muttered when she finished. "Pardon my language, madam, but men like that." He shook his head, then turned to Yates. "So what's your plan? Hiding out isn't a long-term solution, not for a man like you." "Need work," Yates said simply. "Something that uses my skills but keeps me away from law work where I might be recognized." Jake considered this, drumming his fingers on the table. "Could use a foreman, someone to manage the hands, oversee breeding stock." A slow smile spread across his face. "Especially someone who knows horses like you do, and if that someone happened to have a wife who could help with the books, all the better." Cecilia straightened. "I can do that. I kept my father's accounts before." She trailed off, then continued more firmly, "I'm good with figures." "Then it's settled," Jake declared, refilling their glasses. "You'll stay in the old cabin near the east pasture until you get on your feet. Previous foreman left it in decent shape." "Jake," Yates began, his voice rough with emotion. The older man waved him off. "You do the same for me." "Have done, if I recall Bolivia correctly." Later, as they settled into the small but comfortable cabin that would be their home, Cecilia felt a sense of peace she'd almost forgotten was possible. "It feels too easy," she admitted as she unpacked their few possessions. After years of running to simply stop, Yates crossed to her, taking her hands in his. "Not easy, just right." He studied her face. "You're safe here, Sarah, we both are." The use of her new name reminded her of the reality of their situation. "Do you think we'll ever be able to use our real names again, maybe someday when Nathaniel Carter is dead or has forgotten his vendetta?" He brushed a strand of hair from her face. "Until then, we're Thomas and Sarah Wilson, and that's not such a bad thing to be." "No," she agreed softly. "Not bad at all." 3 months passed in a rhythm of hard work and quiet evenings. Thomas proved an excellent foreman, his natural authority and knowledge of horses earning the respect of the ranch hands. Sarah, as Cecilia now thought of herself even in the privacy of her own mind, took over the ranch accounts, bringing order to what had been chaotic bookkeeping. They were married by a traveling preacher who stopped at the ranch, a simple ceremony with only Jake as witness. Their cabin gradually became a home, filled with small comforts and the warmth of shared lives. News from Colorado came irregularly through newspapers and travelers. Nathaniel Carter had indeed inherited his brother's fortune, the death of his sister-in-law confirmed by multiple witnesses. Marshal Yates Jensen was remembered as a good lawman who died in the line of duty. And slowly, the tension began to ease from Sarah's shoulders. She stopped looking over her shoulder whenever they rode into Prescott for supplies. stopped waking in the night, certain she'd heard footsteps outside their cabin. Thomas noticed the change in her, commenting one evening as they sat on their small porch, watching the sunset paint the Arizona sky in shades of gold and crimson. "You're smiling more," he observed, his arm around her shoulders. "Am I?" She leaned into his embrace. "I suppose I am. It's strange not to be afraid anymore. Good strange, the best kind." She turned to face him, her eyes meeting his. "I never thanked you properly, did I? For saving me that day in Willow Creek." He shook his head, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "No need for thanks between husband and wife. Not for that," she clarified, "for seeing me, the real me beneath the fear and the running, for believing I was worth saving. Sarah." His voice was husky as he drew her closer. "You saved yourself, had the courage to leave, to keep fighting. I just provided a little cover fire." She laughed softly, the sound still new enough to bring warmth to his eyes. "More than a little." Her hand came up to trace the scar on his arm, now healed but still a reminder of what they'd survived together. "I love you, Thomas Wilson, or Yates Jensen, whichever name you prefer." "Both are me," he replied, his lips brushing hers. "And both love you, Sarah Carter Wilson, more than I ever thought possible." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the land, Sarah realized that Harold's shadow no longer followed her. In its place was the shadow of the man beside her, not darkening her path, but walking it with her. Step by step, into a future neither of them could have imagined on that dusty street in Willow Creek. 5 years passed, transforming Thomas and Sarah Wilson from newcomers to respected fixtures in the community. The Hollister Ranch prospered under Thomas's management and Sarah's careful accounting, expanding its operations to include one of the finest breeding programs in the territory. Their cabin had grown as well, additions built as their family expanded, first with the birth of their daughter, Emma, and then 2 years later, their son, Daniel. The children thrived in the freedom of ranch life, Emma already showing her father's affinity for horses, Daniel more inclined toward books like his mother. News from Colorado came less frequently now, but what did arrive confirmed that Nathaniel Carter had moved on with his life, remarried, and seemed to have forgotten his vendetta. Still, Thomas and Sarah maintained their new identities, the habit of caution too deeply ingrained to abandon entirely. On the 5th anniversary of their arrival at the ranch, Jake Hollister announced his intention to retire, offering Thomas the opportunity to buy into the ranch as a partner. "Can't think of anyone I'd rather leave it to," the older man declared over a celebratory dinner. "You've made this place more successful than I ever did." Later that night, as they walked back to their home beneath a sky ablaze with stars, Sarah broached a subject that had been on her mind. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked. "Being Marshal Jensen." Thomas considered the question, his arm secure around her waist. "Sometimes, miss the clarity of it, knowing exactly where I stood," he glanced down at her, "but what I have now is worth more than any badge, even with all the complications." She smiled, thinking of their rambunctious children, the challenges of ranch life, the careful maintenance of their secret, especially with the complications. He stopped, turning to face her fully in the moonlight. "Why do you ask? Are you having regrets?" "No," she said immediately, her hands coming up to frame his face. "No regrets. Just thinking about how different our lives might have been if you hadn't been in Willow Creek that day, if you hadn't looked at a frightened woman and seen someone worth risking everything for." He captured her hands, pressing a kiss to each palm. "Best risk I ever took. The cowboy said he'll find no trail here," she quoted softly. "Do you remember telling me that?" "I remember everything about those days," he admitted, "the fear in your eyes. The way you sat a horse like you were born to it, the moment I realized I couldn't let you go." "And you were right," she said, glancing back at their home, where their children slept peacefully. "Harold's shadow never found us here." Thomas drew her close, his kiss a promise renewed. "Some promises a man can keep forever, Mrs. Wilson." As they continued toward home, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment, from a terrified widow fleeing an abusive legacy to a woman who had found not just safety but love, family, purpose. The shadow that had followed her for years had finally faded, replaced by the warm light of a life fully lived. And in the end, wasn't that the greatest victory of all?